Okay. So good afternoon, good evening. My name is Nicola Allenkin. Thank you for joining us. I have the distinct pleasure of having Ms. Leilani Farha, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, with us. And we're going to have just a brief conversation. Ms. Farha, I'd like to just start off by thanking you. And the overall view here for myself and a lot of the students that take this course, we're looking at issues of the unhoused and homelessness from a both local, national, and international approach. So if you could just speak a little bit about your former role with the United Nations, and I know the students would be very interested, and then also with the current agency you direct, the Shift. If you can speak a little bit about that, we'd all appreciate it. So.
Sure. Thank you, Nicola, for inviting me in. And a warm hello to all the students out there. You're the future. So these conversations are super important. And we see with what's happening with climate change that it's the young people that will compel governments to do what they should do and must do in terms of human rights, of the right to live in a healthy environment. So the same holds true with housing. So not to put too much pressure on you, students, but the pressure's on you. I'm really happy to be here. So I was the UN Special Rapporteur from 2014 until 2020. And it's a very privileged position to have held. I always felt that. It's like public office of the highest order. You're trying to move forward human rights. You're trying to bring forward the voices of the most marginalized groups and make them loud and bring them forward to governments and states, we call them states, at the international level, and get them to be responsive to their human rights obligations. And the job involved traveling the world. I had the benefit as rapporteur to go to every region of the world, to many different countries, both on formal visits. That's where a government would invite me in to do an assessment, as well as informal visits. That's where an academic institution or an NGO or charity would invite me in to give a speech, and then I would always take a good look at what was happening on the ground, which is in fact how I ended up going to the United States, and in particular California. I went a couple of times, and I really have been up and down California. Well, really up to down. I started in San Francisco and Oakland. I've been to LA and I've been down to San Diego. And while I was there, I looked at what is the most pressing right to housing issue, which is homelessness, or as you say, the unhoused. I think in all of my work as rapporteur, I really privileged and put as a on the front burner the issue of homelessness. So no matter where I went, that was always one of the first things I would want to look at and understand better. So I've met with people living in homelessness on the pavements in San Francisco and Oakland and LA and San Diego, people living in cars and people living in mobile homes. I mean, RVs. I meant RVs. I've also visited people living in manufactured homes. I've met people who were living in perfectly decent accommodation in California, struggling to pay the rent, but paying the rent. And then one crisis later, or one new landlord later, and one increase in rent later, found themselves living under a bridge or in a tent or in a tiny home if they were lucky, or a tough shed in Oakland. So, and of course, I've seen that across the world. I've visited people living on the pavements of Delhi. I visited homeless people in, well, everywhere, many places, in Egypt, in South Korea, and France, in Portugal, etc. And what struck me, I have to say, in the US and in California, was not homelessness per se. I mean, as I said, I've seen homelessness everywhere in the world. But what struck me and strikes me about the US is, one, of course, the US is the richest country in the world. And as it gets richer and as individuals get richer, homelessness increases and gets more entrenched and becomes more acute. And we should shake our heads about that, because that's backward. That's a backward world. When we talk about economic development and growth, that should be everyone. Everyone should be rising up with that. But that's not what we see in the US and other countries, but particularly in the US, we see the opposite. So over the course of the pandemic, we saw so many more people made billionaires. We saw those billionaires gain wealth. And we also saw people really struggling who are homeless, more people becoming homeless as a result of the pandemic. And so that's one that struck me. And the other thing that struck me, and this is hard for Americans to hear, but the cruelty, the absolute cruelty that the homeless population experiences by the state. And by state, I don't mean the state of California, although I do mean the state of California, but I mean the city of ... I mean the state of California, and I mean the government of the United States of America. And the cruelty, the disposable nature of people living in homelessness, the absolute criminalization of people living in homelessness, the complete discrimination against people living in homelessness is what informs policy in so many places across the US, but in that I saw in California. And that is different than elsewhere in the world. I'm not saying there aren't places. I went to Lagos, Nigeria. There is a criminalization of people living in homelessness, but there is also at the same time a kind of turning away by the governments there, a turning away of saying these folks are they got to live somewhere. So, okay, they're going to live in these informal settlements. So it's not human rights compliant. Turning away is not human rights compliant, but it is also not cruel in the way that forcing people to move, harassing them, making them take down their tents, cleaning streets. It's such a disgusting concept because they claim they're cleaning the street, but you know that they're cleaning it of people. That kind of like the logical extension of the policies being that this population shouldn't exist. That's cruel.
Yes. Thank you for illuminating that. We've seen locally, and one of the things that's come up very locally is this juxtaposition between policy. For us at the local level, we've heard spend money on the issue, billions of dollars. We've had taxpayers involved in that in a literal sense as well too. And then we see very much, as you described, this inhumane approach, this cleanup approach that then becomes criminalized. And so one of the things I think that strikes me, and it's a lot of my students have asked, the United States is a party to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which lays out very simply and very clearly the basic recognition of human rights, particularly the right to adequate housing. And so I think when we see this issue for many of us, and it's not adequate housing, as you mentioned, it's sort of a cleanup approach. And so that those that are in adequate housing feel a little bit better about themselves because they don't see these people. We have a very much of a disconnect in our society, out of sight, out of mind approach. And so maybe if you could speak a little bit about, and this is one of the questions which I think is a great question. There must be many naysayers about this. Otherwise, this would be a very universal thing, right? We can't have these contradictions, as you pointed out, if we all believe in these basic human rights. So are there any individuals or states even that provide counter arguments as to why housing should not be a human right, or why the approach that we use sometimes locally is a out of sight, out of mind approach. So could you speak a little bit about what are some of the things that you hear both internationally and at a local level that people say, sure, I believe in human rights as housing as a human right, but we shouldn't be doing this because what are some of the things that you hear, Ms. Farha?
Well, I think where people living in homelessness are concerned, the argument goes, let's say, very few states would now say, no, we don't believe housing is a human right. That would be, I think at this stage, that wouldn't pass muster. But what they'll say, so I'll say, okay, so you understand housing is a human right, but like you're treating this population this way. And normally what happens is the individuals get pathologized. So those living in homelessness, no link is made between, for example, what's happening in the real estate and housing sector at the wealthy end of things with homelessness and housing precarity, right? Those connections haven't been made by politicians because it's not in their interest to make those connections because they're often quite embedded in the housing sector, housing as an investment, housing as a commodity. It's where people park and hide and grow money, right? So they don't want to make those connections often. There is what we call state capture by the big financial actors that have engaged in real estate. So, and by state capture, I mean they have a seat at political tables, and you'll see this at the micro level, at the city level, where the mayor's campaign was funded by the developers and by these big financial actors. You'll see it in California where Proposition 10, for example, gets defeated because of all this big capital flowing in from these real estate actors like Blackstone, for example. And so that's what I mean by state capture. They have real influence, real grip on decision making at political level. And so they don't make these connections and they pathologize. And by pathologize, I mean, they say, come on, these folks are drug addicts. This isn't about the right to housing. They could be housed if they want to. They could work if they want to. They're lazy. They're criminals. They're drug addicts, etc. Now we know it's absolutely impossible. It's impossible that you could have more than 500,000, probably like 700,000 people living in homelessness and it not be a structural issue. Right. Impossible. And that's true in every country. The numbers are way too high. There used to be a time in the olden days in some countries where, you had a handful of people who were homeless and they really were older white men often who had a substance abuse, normally alcohol problem, but that is yesteryear. That is not where we are now. We know that there are real structural issues, and in the United States, those structural issues are race issues, absolutely. And I mean, we could draw a line between now and redlining, which is an ongoing phenomenon in the United States, actually, right? We can say after the global financial crisis, who were the victims of predatory loans in the global financial crisis? Racialized households. Who is falling into homelessness as a result of the global financial crisis? Racialized households. Which households does private equity eye in terms of purchasing? Which multifamily units, like apartment buildings and single family homes, which are they buying up in racialized communities? So we know this is all structural. But to get governments to recognize that is a different thing. So there's two things that would have to happen. And that's what I've been working on through my role, both as rapporteur and now as the global director of the Shift, an NGO. Well, not really an NGO. We don't call ourselves that. We're more like a movement. But two things would have to happen. We would have to stop pathologizing people living in homelessness and understand that they are victims of the structures of society and systemic racism, for example. One. And two, we'd have to draw a connection between policies, legislation that benefits financial actors in the area of housing that is creating homelessness. I mean, there's more that would have to be done, but those are two big pieces.
So, for many of us, myself included, in this work, we know that these policy implications are very real. These structural, particularly racial, uh, uh, oppression, just the re-traumatization, particularly for people of color who have experienced
Yeah.
slavery in our history and in many other societies. But um, many times, for myself, even, I'm sure at times you feel very frustrated with sort of the lack of understanding in this around this issue. Now, I know recently in LA, we had a recent report a few years ago that really helped to identify the Black African American experience of homelessness, which I think was excellent. It was a great first start. But that, as you mentioned, seems to be pushed aside, and the pathology continues and the criminalization continues. So what would you say to someone? You mentioned our young students and people that are of younger age cohorts really are the future. I agree with that, not just in this issue, but as you mentioned, climate issues and social and ecological and housing rights issues are very much akin, very much parallel together.
Yeah.
So um, what could I do? I'm upset. I see this racial injustice, and I see the ineffectiveness of policy, and I see people being marginalized even further. I think the tip of the iceberg, the analogy that I use in my course is, there's a tip of the iceberg homeless individuals we see, which are those that are on the streets. And the rest of those individuals, the many of them that are in inadequate housing or uninhabitable
Yes.
housing, or living, 10, 15 people in a small space. Um, and I know the shift does this. I'm glad you mentioned it as a movement, because this certainly has to be tackled as a movement. What can I do? I see these disparities, and I see my local politicians may not be listening to this issue. What do I do? What are some of the basic things that I can do to move this movement? Because I think for us to achieve housing equity, I think it involves everyone. And I appreciate your pointing out those that are very rich, that use housing as a metaphor. And we've seen it a lot in California, investments in quote unquote affordable housing, but as a return on investment for people, and not really for the sake of creating a space that is sustainable, right? Again, just kind of putting people into categories and putting them in certain geographic locations, and not allowing them to really be a part of the rest of communities as a whole. So what can I do? I'm seeing this. I understand the issue. I understand housing is very important, a very important variable to this problem. Well, what are some things that I can do?
Mhm. Yeah, it's always so tough to answer that question in a way that really resonates with people and makes people feel like, yeah, but a few thoughts. First of all, really educate yourself, which is what you're doing. Obviously, you're taking this class, so that's part of your education. But it's super important to really know and understand this, and know that if you adopt a position that is contrary to dominant frameworks, you will get pushback constantly, whether you send out a tweet or you put up an Instagram post or you do a TikTok, whatever. If you put out a narrative that is contrary to the dominant narrative, you will always get pushback, but don't let that stop you. And I get it, despite my years of experience, my level of expertise, I still get constant pushback and a lot of actually trolling and hateful stuff. But that doesn't stop me, because I really believe in human rights, and I've seen too much suffering to know that the current system, it just doesn't work. It's just clear. It's clear that our current system doesn't work. So So be courageous, I guess, is part of what this is. So learn and be courageous with what you know. The second thing I would say is on the learning front, there are tools out there and there are things that you can do. I'll give an example to bring people into your frame. So for example, I was in a documentary film called Push. It's very much about the issues that we're talking about, not homelessness per se, but it's very much about the connection between big finance, big capital, and what's happening on the ground. We don't go to California, but we go in the film to New York, for example, and to a fellow living in Harlem who's being pushed out by big finance. And it goes to this issue of housing precarity. And so you could, for example, host a screening of Push. And like now with COVID rules lifting, you can even do it in your home. You could do it at a community center, wherever, bring it to a community that's under threat and just watch the film and then watch the conversation that evolves after the film. It's really amazing that the film, I didn't make the film, so I'm not pushing my own product. Actually, it was made by a Swedish filmmaker who just happened to approach me. But the film has generated a lot of action at city level. It's been shown to city councilors, for example, who then are a bit like, it's still what you're looking for always to make change. Actually, this is my change making method. I love low hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. I'm not looking to change the corporate elites right now. I mean, maybe if they hear me and they find me charming or something, they might change. But I'm looking for the person, the entity, the institution that's on the cusp of change and just needs to be pushed a little bit. And Push the Film can do that, for example, or that kind. It doesn't have to be Push the Film. It could be some other vehicle for gathering people and promoting discussion. I also think that we all need to be speaking to our elected officials and saying very clearly, for me, living in this community, or me as a young person, I'm not just afraid of what's going to happen with the environment and the climate. I'm really afraid about housing. I'm a student. I'm living in my car. I mean, in California, this is a phenomenon, or I have friends who are students who are living in their cars. Where are we going to live once we get these jobs? We're going to have huge student debt and housing is so expensive. So even if I get a decent job, where am I going to live? To articulate it as a human right, to say, I understand that this is in international law and maybe we should consider it being in domestic law. And that's where I think those conversations should go. I think our politicians, and I've heard a few politicians in California are quite interested in legislating the right to housing. And I think a push around that, don't be fooled to think that law is going to change anything. It won't. It's what you do with the law once it's in place that changes things. But you need the law to be in place. It does have an incredible power for people living the experience of violations of the right to housing to know that elected officials understand that that is a violation of human rights. That's powerful, but that doesn't make change itself. Right. So it makes the homeless person or the person living in housing precarity feel good, but that doesn't make change itself. But once the law is in place, then you can start imagining, well, what does that law mean at local level, at state level, at national level?
Okay. So being courageous, and also when we see opportunities, particularly in terms of policy, kind of pouncing on those opportunities and really pushing and integrating those opportunities.
That's right.
Excellent.
That's right. And creating conversation. I think I do think that when I started as rapporteur in 2014, how the human right to housing, I noticed right away, didn't have currency. No one was fluent in it. Let's put it that way. And I worked really hard to try to make it seem reasonable, easy to understand, accessible, and just, something that must be implemented just like that, easy. And I think my work did help in that way, but I think we all need to talk about it, make it become fluent in it, and help our elected officials become fluent in it too. And I notice a change, when for elected officials first start getting interested in the right to housing, there's a timidity with which they speak. And then fast forward 6 months of them thinking it, breathing it, sleeping. And then suddenly they're like, no, housing has to be affordable, accessible, etc. So we have to create fluency. That's right.
Right. So those are really good tips. I think, and this is part of this conversation is doing that as well too, particularly in pushing ideas and making them, I like the word currency,
Yeah.
making them real, making them tangible for us. Excellent. So I think we can end, if we can just talk a little bit about the shift as an organization. And then this is probably a question, I don't know if you've heard it before, but it's a great question that has been on my mind. I've thought about it for the last 2 decades in working in homeless issues. We wake up tomorrow and we have everybody housed. Then what? What is the next issue, or what are the next types of social problems that, as advocates such as ourselves, that we would want to engage in? So,
sure. I'll just say a word about the shift. So the shift is, as I said, it's more of a social movement to secure the right to housing and to shift away from dominant paradigms that undermine the right to housing. So paradigms like homeless people are criminals or encroachers, paradigms like housing is a commodity and best used as an investment vehicle or a financial tool, and that all growth is good growth, those sorts of things. So trying to shift away from those narratives and those paradigms. What we really care about is government accountability, because that's what human rights really is about. As was said earlier in our discussion, governments have agreed to certain international human rights principles and actually have made legal obligations. So the US, for example, has ratified a couple of treaties or conventions, covenants, we call them. One that deals with racial discrimination, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and another that deals with civil and political rights, including the right to life. And there is no issue in the housing domain that triggers the right to life more than homelessness, obviously, and the pandemic exposed that in an extraordinary way. So those are legal obligations that governments have made. And so the shift is about holding governments accountable to the legal obligations that they've made. In terms of your question, I mean, I would put back to you when you say, okay, so we've, everyone is housed. For me, that doesn't solve homelessness. So have we recreated the structures that actually cause homelessness? Have we undone all of those structures and the systemic racism, et cetera? Assuming that we have, then we're all living in a much better society and a happier society. And we might all be able to pursue things that are of more interest to ourselves than having to deal with cruel governments and discriminatory laws and et cetera. One thing that I really want to emphasize is the relationship between the human right to live in a healthy environment and to a healthy environment, and the human right to housing. And I think that nexus is probably, I don't know if that's next stage, but that's certainly here and now. Think about, well, I don't know if people are following the news, but right now air pollution is a big issue in India, in Delhi in particular. And you think about, okay, so what did the government do? What move did they take? Not dissimilar from the pandemic. They said, people stay home. Industries closed down, everyone stay home for a few days and let's let this air pollution go down. Well, what does that mean for people living in homelessness or who are unhoused? And that would be the same in California. If you're having a heat wave and, anything like that, or if you're in Florida and you're experiencing, or Puerto Rico or wherever, and you're experiencing a hurricane or floods, people who are living in homelessness bear the brunt of climate change and climate-related disasters more harshly than anyone else. And then at the same time, when we watch those financial actors engaged in housing and they're building all these skyscrapers and luxury, this and that, none of that is environmental environmentally friendly. We know that the built environment is a huge part of emissions globally. Monster homes, yes, but also these big towers that stand vacant that investors purchase and don't live in. And so we've got to tackle these things at the same time. So I didn't give you a direct answer to the, what next, but an answer on the what here and now.
So the really fundamental structural institutional changes that we all are fighting towards, right? So
that's right.
That a housing is a piece of that solution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And young people are really engaged in the environment. And I would hope that we could connect movements, so the social movement around the right to housing and the movement around the right to a healthy environment, those should absolutely be coalescing. And I think they're going to start.
Yes. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Farha. Anything else as we wrap up? Anything you'd like to add, or any message to us in California? What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong?
No, I don't. I'm not going to answer that. Definitely not. But I do think, there is an emphasis generally when we're talking about homelessness and solutions. There's often an emphasis on, well, we just need to build more housing. And I don't doubt, especially in the United States, I don't doubt that there is a need to build more deeply affordable social public housing and more housing for low-income people. I don't doubt that there's a need there. But I also urge advocates and students to think through, yes, but what about existing housing and vacant housing and short-term lets and let's look at let's do audits of all of our cities. What is out there that is not inhabited, but exists already as a housing unit? And can we avail ourselves of those in new ways? Are there easy conversions that could be done? I'm not talking office buildings, but maybe office buildings, but I'm talking motels that have been abandoned. There are certain things that certain buildings might lend themselves to be repurposed. And let's just not always say, oh yes, we need to build, because building one, we know is, as I said, bad for the environment. Building two really feeds the system that is causing homelessness as well. And if we're not going to regulate that system, then I'm not going to go down that build. Unless we can say build targeted social public housing, deeply affordable housing. I don't want to hear build too much, because I worry about that it feeds the beast. So let's look at some more sustainable solutions that are really at our right on the doorstep.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
It's been a pleasure.
I know you're very busy, so we all appreciate your time, and I'm hoping we'll converge at some point, and on the other side, we can say this was the end of our struggle. So we'll see.
Likewise. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much.